Some islands are forgotten by time, but Ross Island was abandoned because time itself refused to stay there after dark. Ross Island, the broken crown of the Andaman Sea, rose before me like the last memory of a nightmare that refused to drown, and as our tiny boat scraped against the ruined jetty, I felt an old, oppressive weight settle on my chest, something ancient, something bruised and rotting beneath the tropical beauty, something waiting for me ever since the British left this island to die after the earthquake shattered its bones in 1941, and now, after decades of abandonment, the roots of trees had grown through the remnants of their empire like skeletal fingers reclaiming a corpse, and I, foolish enough to come here in search of the perfect horror documentary location, felt that the island had already marked me long before I stepped onto its soil, because from the moment my foot touched the moss-covered steps leading inland, every bird stopped singing, every breeze stopped moving, and the world turned still as if the island inhaled sharply, savoring a new intruder. And as my camera crew, Ravi, Mira, and Adil, followed with gear slung over their shoulders, the silence pressed on us with deliberate cruelty, like the weight of 1,000 prisoners whose ghosts still remembered shackles rusting in the abandoned penal barracks where the British once imprisoned Indian freedom fighters, torturing them in stone cells carved with dried blood and desperate fingernail scratches that remained even today beneath the thick layers of humidity and creeping mold. And though we joked nervously that this was exactly the kind of ambience a horror filmmaker dreamed of, none of us ignored the fact that the shadows of the banyan tree stretched impossibly long, wrong for the time of day, bending like they had minds of their own, fused with memories the island refused to forget. And as we crossed the cracked central pathway toward the old church ruins, its stained glass windows shattered, its pews half buried under twisted roots, the air rippled with a low tremor, not from the earth but from something inside the earth, a pulsing rhythm like a heartbeat buried beneath decades of soil and resentment, making Mira whisper that the island wasn't abandoned, it was simply sleeping, and our presence had just nudged it awake. And when we reached the skeletal remains of the commissioner's house, once a place of colonial luxury now strangled by monstrous trees, the windows gaped open like empty eye sockets watching us, judging us. And when I raised my camera to film, my viewfinder glitch flickered with bursts of static, showing silhouettes drifting behind us though none of us saw anyone when we turned around, and Ravi muttered that maybe tourists or forest guards were nearby, but deep in his voice trembled a fear he couldn't hide, especially when the static distorted into shapes resembling British officers with hollow faces and mutilated torsos swaying behind the ruins as if hung long ago and still dangling between worlds. And as we moved deeper into the island toward the infamous detention cells where prisoners had allegedly scratched stories of unbearable cruelty into the walls, the temperature dropped so sharply that condensation fogged my lens though we were in a tropical climate, and Adil, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cold, confessed he kept hearing the clinking of chains dragging somewhere behind us, but only when no one was talking. While Mira insisted she heard whispered Bengali chants echoing through the corridors even though we were the only humans here, and the deeper we walked, the more the island rearranged itself in ways that felt subtly wrong. The same corridor seemed to stretch longer each time we stepped, certain doorways appeared where none had been seconds before, and the sunlight dimmed too quickly, like dusk was being forced upon us even though my watch said it was barely mid-afternoon. And then, as we set up the camera to film an introduction scene inside the main cell block, the ground shuddered again with the same heartbeat-like pulse we had felt earlier, but stronger, more insistent, as if something buried beneath the ruins was remembering its rage. And suddenly a loud cracking sound erupted from the ceiling beams, ancient wooden structures snapping under invisible pressure, sending dust and debris raining down while our lights flickered violently, and when the flicker ended, Ravi had vanished, disappearing so fast and so silently that for a second I thought maybe he had stepped out, but his equipment still lay on the floor. His half-finished water bottle still upright, and the air smelled sharply of rusted metal and ocean brine, the smell of the old gallows documented in island legends where prisoners were hanged without ceremony, and then a faint scream, distant but unmistakably his, echoed from somewhere deep in the vegetation outside, so we ran, stumbling through ruined pathways overtaken by vines thicker than human arms, vines that seemed to tighten and unwind as if following us, pushing us toward the old British graveyard at the far end of the island, where rows of leaning tombstones lay cracked and half swallowed by roots, and there, between the graves, we found fresh drag marks in the dirt, leading toward a collapsed bunker in trance partially hidden by bushes, and though every instinct screamed at us to flee to the boat, the sound of Ravi sobbing faintly from inside the darkness forced us forward, so we crawled through the narrow opening into a stale underground chamber that smelled of salt water, mildew, and old death. And the deeper we went, the more the walls revealed carvings, names, tally marks, crude silhouettes of men being whipped or starved, and beneath them layers of fresher scratches, some spelling out warnings, some spelling out pleas, one carving reading "They woke you P," and another reading "The earth remembers the pain." And just as I whispered to Mira that we needed to turn back, a cold hand brushed my ankle, impossibly cold, impossibly human, and when I spun around, there was no one in the tunnel behind us except darkness shifting like thick liquid, and Mira grabbed my arm, trembling, saying she saw a pale face behind me in the faint light, a face with empty eye sockets and a mouth sewn shut with roots, and suddenly the tunnel roared with a low moan rising from beneath the floorboards, resonating through our bodies like the island itself was exhaling centuries of buried suffering, and the shadows along the walls elongated, merging into the shape of chained bodies crawling toward us, faces mangled, spines twisted, each dragging rusted shackles whose clinks echoed off the wet stone walls in a rhythmic pattern, clink, clink, scrape, the exact sound Adil had described earlier, and he collapsed screaming that they were surrounding us, even though I saw nothing until the lights on my camera strobed again, revealing the prisoners for a split second, hundreds of them, their translucent forms writhing like drowned souls, reaching for us with bony fingers dripping black seawater. And when the light went out, one of them hissed in a language older than the penal colony, older than the island's recorded history, a sound like coral being crushed underwater, and the ground convulsed violently as if the island were trying to shake off everything, us, the ghosts, the memories, and the ceiling cracked open, letting in a sliver of fading daylight that seemed swallowed by the darkness inside the chamber, and that was when we heard Ravi scream again, this time impossibly close. And his voice was layered with others, dozens of others, screaming through him like they were using his throat as a doorway, and then he staggered into view at the far end of the tunnel, his eyes rolled white, his jaw trembling, his body moving like a puppet pulled by unseen strings, and behind him shadowy forms clung to him, seeping through his skin, merging with his outline, distorting him into something wrong, and when he opened his mouth, seawater poured out as he choked on words that weren't his. The island does not forgive, and at that moment the entire chamber collapsed into a roar of water as if the sea itself punched through the island's underground veins, sweeping us outward, tearing us from each other, hurtling us through darkness and rubble until I felt myself thrown violently onto a rocky shoreline, coughing seawater, bleeding from my forehead, with the world spinning so wildly that for a moment I couldn't tell if I was alive or drowning in a hallucination, and when my vision cleared just enough, I realized the sun had set, the sky was bruised purple. Ross Island had grown impossibly silent again, and I was alone, no sign of Mira, Adil, or Ravi, Only the distant sound of chains clinking somewhere in the trees, slow and deliberate, as if something was walking toward me in no hurry at all, because it knew I could never leave, because Ross Island had taken many prisoners before the British ever arrived, and it was still taking them long after the British were gone, because some islands don't keep memories, they feed on them.